You wake up one morning and feel sadness. You're grieving, you're stressed, you're human. So, in one country, that sadness might be labeled major depressive disorder. But in another, it might be called just thinking too much. And somewhere else, it might not have a name at all because it might not be a disorder at all. Rather, just part of life for that culture. What if the mental illnesses we know aren't universal truths, but cultural creations? Welcome back to Psychiatry Rewritten. My name is Lane. Today's episode is about diagnosis. Not just whether it's right or wrong, but whether it even exists everywhere. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Mental illnesses don't look the same in every culture. And sometimes they don't even exist outside the borders of Western psychiatry. So, we're going to dig into why normal emotions get labeled as pathology, how pharmaceutical marketing shapes diagnoses, and how culture creates syndromes you won't find in the DSM. This isn't about denying suffering. It's about asking a harder question. Basically, are we pathologizing humanity itself? So let's start at home in the United States. Sadness, shyness, grief, even boredom can end up with a diagnosis code. A child who can't sit still in a rigid classroom, ADHD. A person going through a breakup and not eating, major depression. Someone anxious about public speaking, social anxiety disorder. The line between suffering that's part of life and human nature and suffering that's an illness has gotten blurry, partly because our system rewards diagnosis. Because without a label, you don't get insurance coverage. Without a label, you don't get medication. So providers start coding normal human experience as disease. But the thing is, when we over-label, we risk sending a dangerous message or setting a dangerous precedent that every hard feeling is an illness to be medicated, not an experience to be lived through. The DSM, which is psychiatry's Bible, was written through a very Western lens. It assumes individualism, nuclear families, and certain cultural expressions of distress. But what happens when symptoms don't look like what's in the purple book? In some cultures, depression is expressed through the body. Headaches, stomach pains, exhaustion, not sadness. If you only look for tears and hopelessness and catatonia, you'll miss the diagnosis. The opposite is also true, right? We might label someone depressed who, in another culture, is simply enduring a normal cycle of life. The DSM assumes that mental illness is best understood through individual symptoms, biology, behavior, rather than through community, spirituality, or social harmony and balance, which are central in many non-Western systems. For example, in indigenous African or Asian traditions, distress may be seen as spiritual imbalance, disrupted relationships, or ancestral disharmony. Not just an individual pathology, not just something that belongs specifically to that person. The DSM-5 added a glossary. They did add a glossary of cultural concepts of distress to acknowledge these variations. But even this is often treated as an appendix, implying Western categories are the real framework, while others are just cultural add-ons. Because the DSM became the dominant diagnostic system worldwide, insurance, research, funding, and treatment access often hinge on its categories, even in non-Western countries where it doesn't fit well with their cultural system. This creates a risk of cultural erasure, where local ways of understanding distress are dismissed as superstition or not scientific. Arthur Kleinman, he is a medical psychiatrist, medical anthropologist, psychiatrist, and they argued that the DSM reflects category fallacy, basically imposing Western categories onto other cultures where they don't make sense. Others note that even within the West, DSM diagnoses can reflect cultural norms. For example, valuing productivity, independence, and emotional control. So behaviors outside those norms risk being medicalized. So if somebody isn't being extremely productive, or if somebody isn't extremely independent, or if somebody isn't extremely in control of their emotions, then they risk being diagnosed. So in short, the DSM was written through a Western biomedical lens that prioritizes symptom checklists and scales and brain-based explanations and individual pathology. While useful for standardization, it risks over-pathologizing difference and under-recognizing cultural meaning. Another example, in Zimbabwe, the phrase kufungisia means thinking too much. People describe it as ruminating or worrying or just overstimulation and overload of the mind. In the US, we might call that generalized anxiety disorder or a panic disorder or a panic attack. But in Shona culture, it's not necessarily pathology. It's just an expression of stress and social hardship. Okay, so I forgot to talk about this huge part of the video earlier that I wanted to talk about. So I gave you this video of these fish to watch while I add this part in, and then we'll go back to the regular video after this is over. Okay. So let's travel the globe for a minute, because if you live in a different culture, your diagnosis might look nothing like ours. Ataque de nervios, which is from Latin America, and they are sudden episodes of shouting, crying, trembling, sometimes dissociation, often triggered by family stress. In Puerto Rico, it's understood, named, and validated. In the DSM, not really. Susto, which is also from Latin America, is a condition that translates to soul loss, and it occurs after a frightening event. The symptoms are sadness, fatigue, loss of appetite, and in Western psychiatry, this might look like PTSD or depression or trauma, but locally, it's treated with a ritual, not Prozac. Hikikomori, which is from Japan, is a social withdrawal so extreme people don't leave their rooms for months or sometimes even years. In Japan, it's framed as a cultural phenomenon tied to academic pressure and family structure. In the US, it might be misdiagnosed as depression or even psychosis or agoraphobia. There's also DOT syndrome from South Asia, which manifests as anxiety and fatigue linked to the belief that semen loss causes weakness. It's not in Western psychiatry, but it causes real distress in India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. There's also amok from Malaysia and Indonesia, which is a sudden and unprovoked violent outburst followed by exhaustion or amnesia even. It reminds me of intermittent explosive disorder, or IED, in Western psych. It's where we get the phrase running amok. In Western psychiatry, we'd try to force fit it into an impulse disorder or intermittent explosive disorder. These aren't meant to be quirky. They're reminders. The human mind doesn't just produce universal illnesses. It produces culture-shaped suffering, and the way we respond depends on where and who we are. And then there's just sadness versus depression. In the US, persistent sadness is often medicalized into major depressive disorder if it lasts long enough or affects function. In some East Asian cultures, sadness is misunderstood more as a natural ebb of life or just as a communal experience rather than a personal flaw. For instance, feeling prolonged sorrow after a loss, after a death, isn't automatically pathologized. It may be honored as evidence of loyalty or the depth of love that you have for someone. In contrast, DSM criteria risk collapsing that moral sadness, that poetry into pathology once it crosses arbitrary thresholds. There's also anxiety versus nervous temperament. In Western psychiatry, excessive worry equals generalized anxiety disorder. But in other cultures, high vigilance or nervousness is expected for survival or social cohesion. And I can think of places in the United States right now where being alert would serve someone more than not for survival. In parts of the Middle East and Africa, caution and suspicion are adaptive traits in unstable or unsafe environments. Labeling this as a disorder could erase the cultural context where being anxious is being wise. There's also individualism versus collectivism. Western psychiatry assumes emotions live inside the individual. But in collectivist cultures, emotions are often seen as shared states between people, emotions and energies being transferred between people. They don't just exist within one person to the next. For example, and that goes back to energy cannot be created nor destroyed, only transferred. For example, in some Pacific Islander cultures, grief or stress might be experienced as a family illness rather than an individual one. A U.S. clinician might diagnose one grieving person with depression, but a Samoan family might see it as a collective mourning that no one will or should face alone. In the West, we expect people to talk about mood with words like sad, hopeless, or depressed. In China or parts of South Asia, do you guys want another image? Hang on a second, I can give you that. I'll give you another cool video. Hang on, you want something trippy? Okay, there you go. So, in China or parts of South Asia, people often express distress through body complaints. Stomach pain, fatigue, headaches. This isn't avoidance. It's the culturally acceptable way to signal suffering. A Western doctor might call this somatization or even conversion disorder. But in that culture, it's simply how pain speaks. In the West, women expressing rage may be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, while men may be seen as just angry or aggressive or masculine. In some indigenous cultures, anger in response to injustice is understood as a healthy protective force, a healthy coping skill, and also part of communal responsibility. But here, the DSM pathologizes what another culture views as strength. Another place that we diverge is with spiritual and mystical experiences, because hearing voices in the United States raises automatic concern for psychosis. But in many indigenous and religious contexts, Hearing voices or seeing visions is understood as contact with ancestors, spirits, or the divine. Whether that's honored or hospitalized depends entirely on cultural perspective. In Germany, they have a word called Weltschmerz, which translates to world pain. And this is a specific melancholic feeling of sadness about the world not living up to your ideals. In English psychiatry, there is no single diagnostic or even common word for that. We might awkwardly say existential depression or existential crisis or philosophical melancholy. But this shows how culture can give vocabulary to nuanced states of being, which in turn affects whether they're seen as pathology or poetry. Now we're back to fish. In Portugal and Brazil, there is a word called saudade, which translates to a deep nostalgic longing for something or someone absent, often with sweetness and pain intermingled. So it's like a bittersweet longing, missing somebody. This emotional category, though, has no true English equivalent. In the US, similar feelings might be absorbed into depression or grief, but the subtle cultural beauty of saudade, part sorrow, part cherished memory, is lost. In Finland, there's kalsarikani, which is the feeling of drinking alone in your underwear at home with no intention of going out. It's considered an actual word for a socially accepted mood or just state of being. In US psychiatry, that might trigger concern for alcohol misuse or depressive behavior, agoraphobia, isolation. But in Finland, it's just Tuesday. So basically, if you don't have a word, you might not see the thing. Or if you have a word, you might see the thing for something that it might not be. Western psychiatry often ignores experiences that don't map onto DSM categories. If you do have a word, it can normalize or honor it. In some cultures, naming the state makes it shared, meaningful, and not necessarily illness. The DSM, written in English with Western values, tends to reduce these rich states into symptom checklist, missing the cultural meaning entirely. The big takeaway, I guess, from all of, I told you I missed a lot. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? Emotions aren't universal disorders. They're interpreted through culture. What the DSM calls depression, anxiety, or psychosis might elsewhere be respected sorrow, adaptive vigilance, family mourning. That doesn't mean these conditions aren't real, but it does mean we need to ask who benefits when normal human variation is turned into a lifelong prescription. So, what's the alternative? It's not pretending suffering doesn't exist. It's just widening our lens. Sometimes grief is grief. Sometimes worry is a cultural expression of hardship, not a disorder. And sometimes sadness is part of living in a human body in a world that can be very difficult to live in. It can be sad. By naming every emotion a disorder, we risk robbing people of meaning. But by ignoring suffering, we risk abandoning people who need care. The challenge is balance. Recognizing when medication helps, and then whenever meaning, culture, and community support are the real medicine. Family mourning, somatic language, or spiritual calling, spiritual guidance, ancestral guidance. We also can't ignore money. Some diagnoses explode in popularity right now after a new drug comes out on the market. Social anxiety disorder wasn't common language until Paxil was marketed for it in the late 90s. ADHD diagnoses skyrocketed alongside stimulant marketing. PMDD was added into the DSM not long before certain medications targeted it. That doesn't mean if you lived in another country, another culture, another century, you might not have the same diagnosis you do today. Maybe your panic would be called cysto. Maybe your sadness would be seen as a rite of passage. Maybe your social withdrawal would be framed as introspection or a spiritual journey or spiritual searching. The point isn't that one culture is right and another is wrong. My point is to have you look at mental illness differently and really understand that it doesn't define you. Your diagnosis doesn't define you. Mental illness is never just biology. It's biology shaped by culture, economics, history, and power, and politics. So the next time we ask, what's wrong with me? Maybe the better question is like, who decided this was wrong in the first place? Okay. That's all for today, for today's topic. Thank you for being here. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear me talk about more mental health topics. I'll see you next time. Bye.